electricity from and the controversy between bioelectricity and the standard electricity that comes through our from Tampa Electric, the differences. And then we just barely got into the history of brain and discovery of EEG. We talked about the pioneers of neuroscience, Ramon Cajal and Golgi, and then the rise of British neurology, the classical spinal reflex that all of us, know from basic biology. And we talked about some of the receptors that we, deal with, like the standard acetylcholine, and I think, and just like a lot of senior citizens, some of you may be watching Jeopardy, and you see the commercial nowadays for this disease, okay, which is myasthenia gravis, which is a very common muscular weakness. All of a sudden, you get, your arms and legs get weak, and when it gets dramatically worse, you have difficulty breathing, and it can be a pretty serious illness. So, and this segues into the receptors. See this acetylcholine, which is like the workhorse chemical of the neurotransmitter, and that the body forms antibodies against acetylcholine breakdown enzyme, and so that's how you get the muscle weakness. And the interesting thing I started wondering, why am I seeing the commercial for this rather uncommon illness? So I had to, it's one of those called monoclonal antibodies, basically. And the cost of this is, hope you're all sitting down, $500,000 per year. It's called Weavguard. So if you see the commercials, so I mean, granted, it is expensive, but I didn't bother to look up the company, but just to segues into American healthcare system. And obviously, the Botox injections are popular, but the good thing is, think about is once you go it in about 4 months, it wears out. So you have to have more injections. So that's a big business for plastic surgery, or as it is called, cosmetic surgery. Because I'm trying to add in, because I mean, at the heart, I'm not a real scientist, as I claim, because I'm just a lowly doctor. So I'll throw in some of the medical item which may be of personal interest. Now, because this is an interesting story, just to keep people's interest. I know we'll talk about heart attack later on, but I thought this story was absolutely, because I'm trying to put in on the time sequence as well, rather than doing compartmentalized talk. Now, this is an interesting story that in the British Parliament, there was a question about public experiments on a dog. And some of the women who were the anti-vivisectionist society posed a question with one of the members. A poor dog was with a leather strap and sharp nails secured around his neck, his feet being immersed in a glass jar containing salts connected by wires. Now, if that is not cruelty against animals, we don't know what it is. So the new act against animal cruelty should be enforced, and these vicious doctors and the scientists should be, censored and stopped. And finally, the Secretary of State, Mr. Gladstone, not the same one who was the Prime Minister, I understood the dog stood for some time in water, which is none other than sodium chloride. So if the honorable friend has ever paddled in the seawater, they'll understand the sensation. The dog, a finely developed bulldog, was neither tied nor muzzled. He wore the rather expensive brass-studded collar, and the experiment was far from painful. So that just shows about the public sentiment versus, the truth. So I think so. This was the earliest experiment, done on, bioelectricity of the heart. So that was now obviously, this was just done as a trick to show type of thing, because obviously the current was, rather weak, and they had no way to. And so then this again, for some of you may have talked about the diabetic class, and there was the medical students and the brown dog. So there is actually a statue of brown dog in London. That was part of the dog experiments, which were done by the people who discovered insulin. But so this is just thought there was an interesting human interest story that you enjoy. But that talks about how the rise of electricity at the same time. That was, I know, brain and heart were the two organs, and these are the most important ones. And the part of it is I'll talk more about it later because they are the biggest energy consumption. So they use up more electricity is much more involved in these two organs. Okay. I mean, it's hard to put electrodes on the liver, by the way. Okay. Liver is more forgiving. So this was a demonstration at the Royal Society by Dr. Waller's pet bulldog named Jimmy, and the signal was weak, which talked about. So, okay. And this was how scientists can be wrong as to, I do not imagine this is likely to find any extensive use in hospital. It can be rare occasion be useful for some anomaly of the cardiac function. This reminds me of the statement by IBM head Watson. There may be a demand for at the most one or two computers that I see. Okay, so how underestimated they were. Okay, anyway, so, and this is, for the medical people or the people with a nursing background may recognize this as to how we have learned from our uh, standard model organism, the frog. We saw Galvini use the frog. Similarly, a physician named Dr. Sidney Ringer was doing experiments, on a frog heart. Okay, and obviously by this time the chemistry was advanced enough that they were familiar with the concept of isotonic, means the same pH as to the body solution. So they were mixing sodium chloride solution and potassium, but his assistant made a mistake that instead of pure distilled water, he took the river water, which had calcium, and just turned out to be a happy accident that the frog's heart was alive for a lot longer time. So that was the idea that calcium was needed for heart. Okay, so this is an interesting how by chance they stumbled into. So he decided to add calcium also to. So if you remember that if you go with bleeding or volume loss, the hospitals will not give you plain intravenous water because that would be wrong for your body osmolality. So they use the Ringer solution, which is, and later on another physician whose name I don't recall added lactate the solution. So that is a standard replacement of Ringer's lactate. Okay, so and this led to various receptors. Okay, and we'll talk more about it when we talk in more detail about the physiology. And so varieties of receptors are used. The sodium and potassium receptors, and so. Okay, so this is just an interesting human interest story about the medical uses of it. We talked about Hans Berger and his tragic testing that he was denied that Nobel Prize and he committed suicide, so never really got the nod from Stockholm. Okay, and by this time, during the Nazi era, the communication across Europe and America, because of the Nazi sort of embargo had taken place, so he was not aware as to how his EEG was being widely used by, especially by physicians and scientists in America. And then there was the advance of sleep science. And before we started, we were talking about how if you had a sleep study, or then you'd know that how it has dramatically changed the various patterns of sleep. And even my Fitbit wristwatch talks about the rapid eye movement sleep. And I still haven't figured out what algorithm they use, but it is pretty accurate. Now, and obviously this was a dramatic advance in diagnosis of epilepsy, which was, always a thing with a lot of misunderstanding with witches and demons, when people had seizures. Okay, and the standard is he recorded the amplified the action potential. And now, even before this, those of you who are, remembering a name, then when there was a resurgence of electrophysiology, a guy named Raymond was uh, doing more experiments in electrophysiology after the bad reputation they got from Galvini's nephew. And I'm sorry, go ahead. Yeah. And so at that time, they had recorded that there is actually a field, not just a big spike, a pattern that is recorded, but there is actually a field that affects, So, and as some of you who are more familiar with particle physics may be aware of Higgs field, which was the big discovery from the Large Hadron Collider in physics. So the same way, there are electrical fields and that may be, like you remember that some farmers say that cow's milk production is affected by the huge power lines. So there may be some truth to that, but and so a lot of this field research was kind of was taken with a grain of salt by a mainstream scientist, but there is something to it, and with more sensitive equipment, people are able to record this. And and this is one of the things about preparing talks for Ollie, even though I have, as a physician and as cardiologist, I've been interested in electrical properties of the heart for a long time. I just learned something. There is a word that was coined, which, a lot of physicians are not aware. It's called ephaptic coupling, EPHAPTIC. And I had to look it up what that is. That means touching contact. Okay. If the two nerve fibers are close to each other, there is a slight signal that is transmitted. It is, and I was thinking as we were talking about how cells collaborate and talk to each other, it's almost like gossip with your neighbor. So the nerves are not just all and none, that a single impulse comes and then everything is all quiet on the nerve on the wave front. But there is actually something called the ephaptic coupling. And there was, as the recording equipment for field potential became more uh, powerful and sensitive, they were able to record this. And this was a study done by a woman neurophysiologist who was French and Greek, done in the 1940s, but her work was never, taken very seriously. But it is coming into the vogue. So that is something that, so we are learning more with better equipment as to what is going on, at a lower level. Similarly, like we learn in quantum science. And now this is an interesting story that some of you may know about. A German Jewish scientist who was, like it happened to hundreds of other people, he had to run from Nazi Germany in the 1930s and was supported by the Dean of British Neuroscience, okay, Adrian, okay, and it was able to find work at University College of London. And it's interesting that he was working on a chemical messenger of nerve fibers. And as usual, they were working with frogs. And one night he had a dream, and as to how to do his experiment with the frog heart. Okay. And he wrote down the note on his bedside, table. But I think he was a physician, not just a scientist. And like a lot of physicians, next morning he was not able to read his own handwriting. Okay. Luckily for him, or by fate or kismet, whatever you want to call it, next night he had the same dream. And he wasn't going to wait that time. He just went to his lab and did the experiment and did the two hearts separately in the two chambers. And were not connected, but took the fluid, from one heart and perfused the other heart. And lo and behold, the heart rate slowed down. Okay. And so that was the effect of the vagus nerve. So, so this was, gave him very solid proof about the chemical neurotransmission. Okay. And as we talked about, okay, I'm sorry. Yeah, I am showing the slides, I hope. Can everybody see the slides?
No, there's no slides.
Well, I'm seeing a slide that says Dream and Nobel Prize. Yeah,
I'm
I see it. I see
I
it.
see the slides. I see the slides.
I do too.
Okay, John, I
Okay,
don't know.
well, I'm not seeing it.
Go to speaker view. On the upper right corner, there's a, looks like a tic-tac-toe board. Hit that and go to speaker view. See if that'll work for you.
Yeah, I'll wait for John to, so, yeah. I'm glad I-
Now I'm seeing the speaker. I see multi-speaker gallery, sort by, I either have speaker, gallery, or multi-speaker.
Yeah, go to speaker view, and I think that'll show. That's what I'm on. I'm seeing
Our
the
gallery.
speaker in a little box at the corner, but I see the slide.
How about gallery
That sees everybody.
view?
I have view, but
How about, do you have speaker view?
I don't have the choice of speaker view. I have speaker,
Oh.
gallery, multi-speaker.
Oh, okay.
Okay, but
Last week I had to sign out and sign back in to get the slides.
yeah, that may be, I was going to suggest that, yeah, that John sign out and come back in again. I think that
Okay,
might work, so I don't, that was I was about to say the same thing. Yeah, sorry about that, yeah, John, because that's what I would appreciate, and, okay, yeah, but so at least majority of all of you are, the rest of you are seeing the slides, so, okay, so he will come back in, and John knows all of these anyway, so we'll continue with this, I think, and, I will, and obviously I'll be sending him. Okay, so I'm just trying to catch up with all now, at the same time, neurosurgery, what, okay, yeah, he's back, hopefully. John, you're muted, so you can tell us that whether you're seeing the slides
yeah,
or
now
not.
I see slides.
Oh, hey, God, hooray. Okay, so, okay, so, and now by this time, epilepsy was, we had rather very primitive medications for treating epilepsy, which is one of the very common neurological disease, So a neurosurgeon named with a interesting name named Penfield. He was an American actually, born in Spokane, not in Washington State. Then worked in Wisconsin, where I was, and when eventually ended up being a Rhodes Scholar, and somehow ended up working at Toronto General. And Mr. Penfield, as they're called in the British and Canadian system, he did about thousands of operations, and a brain that does not have pain fibers. So the patients are awake when they're operating. So they were able to put electrodes on the brain and stimulating different areas where to cut the epileptogenic focus. He was able to map how the body representation. So this is, the so-called homunculus, which the name goes back to, early 15th century, with a Swiss pharmacologist named Paracelsus, okay, as to how the more sensitive areas of brain are represented, the sensory cortex and motor cortex. So this just shows out electricity in action, basically. So, and this map is still widely used, and it has been modified somewhat, but his work was amazingly, and how precise that was, that when I did the class, that there is actually that time, there is a Hollywood actress named Jennifer Aniston. So when that one area of brain was stimulated, people could picture Jennifer Aniston. So it made become like a joke, there is a Jennifer Aniston neuron. Okay, so that's an interesting thing, but and some people have very specific memories. Says, yep, I smell burnt toast. So as to how precise the representation of images and memories was, okay. But again, this is not a neuroscience class, so I shan't dwell too much onto it. But that is Mr. Penfield's work, and that was very pioneering work, okay. And at the same time, now two other neuroscientists, named, Hodgkin and Huxley. I may have mentioned this for a little bit, but just to refresh him, they wanted to do, really record a nerve impulse from inside of the cell. Now a brain cell, you can't do that on human experiment. So they went for the biggest neuron that they could find, a giant squid axon, and that was big enough, almost like a nice rope. They were able to throw in electrodes, and based on this little oscilloscope, they were able to. Now, obviously, they were not just physiologists, but they were also good mathematicians. So they created a series of partial differential equations mapping this with electricity. And don't even try. I did not wisely. I chose not to put those equation slides because there is like a 1.5 hour lecture on how to formulate these equations from MIT OpenCourseware. So as to how and they had to wait for almost 7 or 8 years to publish their results because they were drafted during the Second World War and worked on radar and other things. So, but eventually their work was groundbreaking and put neuroscience on a really solid mathematical and physical basis. So all these three disciplines were being integrated. Okay. And at that time, that said this current has to be due to, there must be holes in the membrane. That's why we're able to record the positive and negative on each side. Okay. So there were, so that there must be like, so they theoretically proposed that there is something like channels. Okay. So you think that this work was done in the 40s and 50s, but it never really took off afterwards that dramatically. Okay. And for that, there is a reason, okay, which I will get to in a few minutes. Now, this is the basic thing about the action potential, so you can see how the nerve fiber is covered with, myelin sheet, which is a fatty neuron. So during fat, the impulse travels nicely. So this was a nice GIF image. And this is the giant squid. And this is a long video about the action potential through something called Bozeman science, but I'll have better slides. So just for sake of time, I'm not going to get too much into it because I have like a 2 or 3 simple static slides, But this is like a 13-minute video, which we will not, would do have to be an 8-week class to.
They didn't want.
Okay, and this is the link for this, and you can play if you're interested dramatically. This Bozeman Science does a very nice high school level discussion. Okay, and so as we talked about that, these two groups were, were arguing. Eccles was an Australian physiologist, and Dale, and so they were arguing as to what is more important, electricity or testing, and it turned out both of them were right. And going back to they talk about the Ringer's channel, the role of calcium channels was defined as well. Okay, and now just for the science sake, let's get back into some of these things. And now this is a very complicated slide, but I will just go over this. When the action potentials arrives, there are various channels that are activated and that activate calcium ion flows inside. And they release something, this granules called acetylcholine, which is the neurotransmitter. It binds with various receptors and generates an action potential. And then all the sodium rushes into it. Okay. And then it again activates the other side, of receptors. So the varieties of inorganic metals, sodium, potassium, and calcium, there is a nice interplay of it. Now I'm going to get to the bigger slide. Let me see if I can zoom this in to show it to you. Okay. Okay, yeah, so you can see how this little granules and the calcium, and this is the action potential that takes place. And this is, it's a various biochemical cascade. So unless you are a, biochemist or really a chemistry nerd, I would not get too much into it. But this is, the mechanism. So the point is that both of these things work. Now this is a busy slide, but I just thought this is of interest because on this thing is this fancy word called pyridostigmine. Okay, this is a medication that is used for myasthenia gravis, and it just shows as to how biochemistry, physiology, medicine are integrated as to how. So this is where so initial treatment when I was practicing, this would have been the treatment of choice for myasthenia gravis, because at that time we were not aware about all these antibodies and other things. So when when I went out to medical school in the 70s, this is about as good as it got for myasthenia treatment. You took the pills and it worked reasonably well, but the disease marched on. So, but now we are getting into the real biochemical mechanism as to how the body forms antibodies against this, chemical and causes the illness. So this is what we were. So how science gets integrated, and this is the fluoxetine is a good old Prozac, and quinidine is a medication for heart rhythm. So how the basic physiology and pharmacology are integrated. So that was the purpose of sharing you this slide, okay, as to how, okay, and that this is, I think, let me get down further. Yeah, this DHPR, this silly abbreviation is something called dihydropyrimidine, okay, and you may recognize this as one of the common medications, okay, which some of you may even be on. It's called dihydropyrimidine. It's called calcium channel blockers. And if you have taken something called amlodipine for blood pressure, okay, or nifedipine, okay, that is one of the most commonly used blood pressure medications. So the calcium channel blockers are the big cornerstone of blood pressure therapy. Okay, so they're just again interesting. And just a couple of days ago, there was a clue even on the popular quiz show Jeopardy about vasodilators. So that's a common way to treat as to how we are learning the whole disciplines of physiology, pharmacology, and medicine are coming together. Okay, and this was just a repeat of this thing. Now, this is now the most important part of the brain, other than the action potential and moving, obviously that is important. Okay, as we already shown in the reflex and epilepsy, it is the memory. Okay, and this is in search of memory is a famous thing. So, and again, here it comes down, the good old synapses, the presynaptic and postsynaptic, and here they come our friendly molecules, the sodium and potassium, they're rushing in. Now, this has advanced further that there are varieties of receptors. These are like little protein molecules that are sitting there, and with just like a gatekeeper inside a bar or a popular disco. Okay, these are receptors. So initially they are closed, and when get the right voltage, they would open up, and the sodium would gush in, and the channel would open, and eventually only one of these receptors would open. When finally more sodium, when the current strength becomes bigger, more sodium rushing in and goes around, and there is this little magnesium molecule, so it pushes it out and says, okay, that so now the calcium can enter. Okay, so that again is needed for something called long-term potentiation. So if you want to remember memory, that is all tried in. It's a nice dance that takes place of various chemicals, as you can see how evolution has gifted us with this thing as to how these molecules, I mean, so it's a very small amount of magnesium, but you do need that. And calcium is like the workhorse, next to sodium, potassium. Calcium is everywhere in your bones, and so it's a very important molecules. And so this is the mechanism of long-term potentiation. Okay, so enough basic science, and this is like I just got a little carried away with slides. You can see how this is at rest, and hopefully this image will migrate as to how the sodium is rushing in, and here is this magnesium that says nope, you can't get out here. And when more comes in, there goes the magnesium molecule kicked out. Okay, and then finally everything is quiet at peace on the synaptic cleft front. Okay, and this is so this is the video for those who are more interested, but I think you get the gist. And there are various other amino acids that are involved in as well. Okay, and now we were talking about holes inside the membrane, and later on, as science advanced further, these two German physiologists, they developed a technique to actually measure this tiniest electrode, how small it is, it is measured in something called picoampere. So this is even smaller than a nanoscale. Nanoscale is 10 to the power minus 9. Picoscale is 10 to the power minus 12. And obviously they had some tremendous technological breakthrough that they were able to measure these incredibly small electrical current that pass through these small ion channels. You can say, well, what good is it? Such a tiny amount. It's just like less than a drop in a bucket. But there are, millions of ion channels. So when you put all that together combined, it's almost like a bolt of the shop that goes. So inside the cell, there's a little total chaos that is going on. So the amount of total electrical impulse that is going is rather powerful. So they recorded this, and this was a unique technique for the single channel molecule as to how this little, protein molecule that is there, it changed the shape, the way with the current flow, and it lasted again just few millionth of a second. So it's a master of electrical and technological marvel. And obviously their work was recognized, and they were recipients of Nobel Prize in 1991 for ion channel protein. Okay, so Nobel Prizes go through various popularities, and so there were several of them, they were recognized in the late 20th century. Okay, talking just an interesting thing about memory is to work that was done on another snail that is, called Eplesia. And this is a snail that is big, and the snail has a bigger neuron, and it forms the memory because when you touch it, it repeatedly, it withdraws the foot. So that was the working organism that was used as the snail foot by, again, another German immigrant kicked out of who had to run away from Nazi Germany, an Austrian scientist who did his work at Columbia named Eric Kandel, Kandel. And his work was absolutely brilliant on long-term memory potential. And his, these are some of his books, this is from 1990s that I read at that time, In Search of Memory by Eric Kandel. And he talks about his experiences through Nazi Germany, running away as a 10-year-old child and surviving, in settling in U.S. and and later on getting to Nobel Prize. And he writes about the art, German art, and everything else. And it's a very erudite scholar work. Some of his books are absolutely delightful to read about multiple art and science integration. So, so just because scientists can be good writers and enjoyable by all of us. So you may pass into it. Now, obviously, as I mentioned last time, this was the era of the mainframe computers. Okay, and we compared brain to varieties of organs. Initially it was considered as steam engine, various steam pipes, and then later on we got the idea of telegraph and then electrical cables. With the rise of computers, we started comparing brain to computers, and the two people, Warren McCulloch and another mathematician, computer scientist named Norbert Weaver, had proposed the idea of human brain computer interconnection, and that was a science called cybernetics. And those of you who are science fiction fans may remember, the word that was coined by, I forget the name of the guy who wrote about this cybernetics, novels and coined the word. But this was very popular books back in the 50s. And we talked about the role of information as well, which was done from the Bell Laboratory Company, and how the cells are interconnected with, obviously, the change in their chemistry, their energy and electrical potentials through the gap junction. Okay. And how each individual neurons can be connected as well. So it's a whole network instead of, connected. Okay. And so we can say that, with not to take away anything from the importance of genes, okay, but there is a lot of other stuff that goes on in the background, which is the ion channels, the electrical synapses, and so the codes does not have to be altered, but the messages sometimes. So one can just imagine, this is one person's analogy. Yesterday I had sent out a link about Michael Levine, and this is some of his slides. But this is considering hardware. This is the code that we are born with, okay, and the software that, depending upon the situation, if you run into something, you withdraw. So and that's a quick withdrawal that would turn type of thing, and that just shows the reflex as to how electricity. And I'll have more to say about it as we go along. Okay, so, and obviously the evolution is the basis of all the process, and along with the genetic code that we were, but depending upon the need of the situation, it can be, it's not only just read and interpreted, but can be recruited and modified. Some genes are turned off and on, so it's a dynamic process that goes on based on the cell's internal energy and the situation. So one can say, like, for those of you who are familiar with the computer, we have RAM memory and ROM memory. So you can say that this is the book that we were, born with from our mom and dad. And, we kind of, can either write a comic book or a tragic book, so to speak, depending upon the situation. And then also there is, just to use the analogy of computer, there is an error correction code that operates at the same time. Okay, so the analogy is, at least with the time of time. Okay, now this is, we'll segue into cell again and revise the concept that we have come a long way from Leeuwenhoek's day. Okay, this was the start, and we already I've shown you this slide earlier, but it's good to emphasize as basically life started as a single cell, and we have become, multi-cell. We have trillions of cells in our body. Okay, and we hope that they all work together. They are being recycled and replaced. Your liver regenerates, your red blood cells regenerate. Okay, so, but it's a very exquisitely tuned mechanism that is follows the genetic code and sends out messages, and so you're using electricity every time you walk around, basically, so you don't realize, but you're using this. Okay, so it's, energy plays a big role that, a lot of biology textbooks don't emphasize there, but so it's coming to the vogue as to how important it is, and that form of energy that comes around, so the charges that across the membrane, and obviously the energy comes from the food and nourishment that we take in the form of glucose and other chemicals. So we'll talk a little bit more about it. So this is where segue into it. Okay, and okay, and this is, various biochemical processes that take place inside your cell, and it's, and uh, the nourishment that we take is split into carbon dioxide, hydrogen by various enzymes, splits into protons and electrons, and that powered the workhorse of the body called ATP, which stands for adenosine triphosphate. Okay, and so this is, that's the workhorse of this thing, and so and this goes on right from the time of ovulation, okay, till the diet. The electricity and energy has a big role to play, and that's what is always fascinates me when I read about it. There was back in 1930s, there was a scientist named Harold Saxton Burr at Yale, and he was interested, in measuring electricity with microvoltmeter. Obviously, that equipment was not as sensitive, and so he had asked a lot of his female students to record the time of their ovulation and record the body voltage. Obviously, nowadays, if he tried to do that, he would be, chastised for, violation and in Human Rights Committee. Okay, and this is an interesting story that he did find a woman who was willing, that was having ovarian surgery. So at the time of her egg was dropped, they were able to measure the voltage and the change in the voltage inside from her cervix. So she was a very devoted and participant. So they were able to record the change in a voltage right from the time of this thing. So I'll have one more slide about the sperm as well as we go along. Okay, and this is again a slide from Michael Levine's work. Okay, that basically, everything, that we are, in starting out from, we're product of sun that, after from the universe, we started out with life started out, and the normal embryonic development took place all the way, the evolution. Okay, at one time I did the class on human evolution, and I think, so that was fun to look over as to what came first, as to, okay, and then eventually, but we got into things about the so-called mind-body separation from Descartes time, and then when things don't work out, we end up with when the cells don't cooperate, okay, and the changes that take place, we end up with cancer, okay, and then later on, now there is some integration that is taking place with something called organoids, where they could take a cell and make it live in a dish and can work. And okay, so this is the story of yeah. So basically, and people have done some very interesting calculation that how many total atoms would be inside. We have trillions of cells. So people did some back of the envelope calculation. So we may have as many as 94 trillion atoms inside our body. We're counting for 90% of our cell mass. Okay. So this is, that's just a lot of mental masturbation to say. Okay. So I think, and so a lot of so all the three sciences are being integrated, biology, chemistry, physics, and last but not the least, some people are creating mathematical models of this. So all the major disciplines are being interconnected. So science is becoming because lot of times, when we were going to medical school, once you chose biology, you're done with mathematics, okay? Or once you got the basic organic chemistry and other stuff, we were done with it. And same way with physics, we were not, most physicians were not well trained in physics, okay? And it was very compartmentalized, okay? And just the basic fields, just to repeat, electricity is based on charge, which generates fields, and this interconnected of the electrical potential and forces, this is what we are, the focus of this class, okay? And a lot of these changes in the resting potential, they regulate the individual cell differentiations, changing from one type of cells to different type of cells, from stem cells into this thing. So, and proliferation, like multiplication, migration of the cells. And Michael Levine, in some of his lectures, has a cell about how, I would have a slide as to how an individual single cell amoeba-like organism or a prokaryote would be attracted towards the cathode of a nanoelectrode. So I'll have a slide later on, probably next week, as to, so this is, so electricity has been, involved right from the evolution of single cell organisms. And again, so this is important for the changing from, 8-cell embryo to a full-grown tadpole, and later on morphing into a frog. Okay, so it has. Okay, so now this is, I thought this was a nice cynical statement that some of you may enjoy. Biology tells you you're 7% blood, chemistry tells you you're 70% water, physics tells you that you're 99% empty space, because the electron is far away. Actually, it is not like the model that you see on there during the atomic age. The electron is not just next to the nucleus revolving nicely around, okay, because that goes down into the quantum physics, that you cannot determine the Heisenberg principle, the position and the momentum at the same time. But again, I'm digressing. Okay. All right. So let's see how, okay, we still have time. So we are doing very well time-wise. Okay. Let me see if I can zoom in. This is an interesting slide, which I think I could not. Okay, now this is, again, just to repeat type of thing as to how, we have the various ion channels and something called the gap junction. It's just like a narrow vestibule type of opening that takes place. And there are varieties of sodium and potassium influx that we already talked about, and the varieties of sodium and potassium ion channels where the ions can migrate through this. And this was the earliest discovery that we talked about. But since then, there have been about hundreds of ion channels have been discovered, by scientists. And not only that, they can determine the gene for that and actually clone the ion channel to, to study them in a lot more, organized fashion. Okay, and let's zoom down to the lower part of it. Okay, and so, the single cells, so how the bioelectricity is responsible for proliferation, differentiation, all the basic properties, and getting down to the embryo level, either it can be healthy adult, which can develop tissue and organs. Okay, on the other hand, things don't turn out to be good, and sometimes if it can lead to birth defects, and various diseases that can take place, including and if there is problem with the energy of a cell, it can lead to varieties of diseases. And I have some interesting slides about energy that are coming up, so it's like a signal that is needed for transformation from single cell to higher level of biological function. Okay, so in and okay, so I already said all this stuff. That thing knows. I think I'm just looking through my cheat sheets. Okay, and it can again be modified by. I did not put a slide about it, but the energy cell actually communicate with something called tunneling nanotubes, like a little tunnels that go around, so they can actually transfer energy. And so much so that was just recently that was published, and I think I may have sent the slides article to John. Okay, I don't know if he remembers that or not, but this was mind-blowing as to how cancer cells would actually steal energy from a normal cell. So it's just like, okay, I want more power to work around. Give me some of your energy. So forms mitochondria and creates actually like a micro tunnel. So this paper was absolutely mind-blowing as to how it can hijack the machinery of not just the genes are abnormal inside it, but it can actually steal the energy. And there is a nice podcast that is done called virology. This was done by a professor from Columbia who is an expert, who's been doing this class on virology since 2016. He does series of lectures on from the evolution of viruses to all the diseases that take place and what is going on currently. So, and I listened to a lot of this during COVID. Okay, is like the guru of virology on YouTube. His name is Vincent Racaniello. Okay, and he invites another physician who is an infectious disease specialist, whose name I don't recall, and they would try to, really educate people for science. And that's just amazing how much free education is available, if you know where to look. And and this is where I learned about these microtubules that actually And just to side stream, that some of this has microtubules have been proposed as for your memory and consciousness by two people who were initially not taken very seriously for consciousness. One is an anesthesiologist from University of Arizona named Stuart Hameroff, okay, because even though we have been using anesthesia for for like couple of hundred years, we still don't understand how it works, So he had come up with the idea of microtubules, which, are affected in the brain, which is where the anesthetic agents work. Another person who had proposed was astronomer royal named Sir Roger Penrose, who was the worker with Stephen Hawking. And they were the earliest one who proposed the black hole model. And just for later on, he had worked into quantum biology and proposed how consciousness works. And that is where the energy of the mitochondria and the microtubules comes into it. So there is some interesting work, and their work is now being taken a lot more seriously about how consciousness and the brain may be working, and which is again, energy comes back into. Okay, now, again, I'm digressing, but it's kind of fun to, throw in some other information. Okay, now, when it comes to chemistry, and I think John can correct me on this one as we go along, there is more than one bond. Okay, not James, you can recognize, not Sean Connery and other people, but the more bonds that you may have forgotten from a high school class. Okay. And probably John can explain this if he wants to jump in, the three bonds. John, you want to explain this? Because, okay, you can do this, like,
And I'll leave it up to you.
okay, the ionic, the three are main bonds, this is just obviously because because I studied chemistry, more than a half a century ago, but these are the three bonds that we talk about: the ionic bond, the covalent bond, and the metallic bond. We'll just concentrate on in the ionic bonding. Atoms transfer electron to each other, okay, and they kind of work happily with cation and anion. The words are very self-explanatory, and this is the amount of energy that is involved in it. Now this is the kJ means kilojoules per millimole. So these are the various physical chemistry measurements. And the example of that is just good old salt. Okay. And the covalent bond is the nuclear, play nicely with each other and share the electron. Okay. And the classical example of that is none other than water. Okay. So that is all that you need to know for our class, basically. Okay, and obviously there iron is involved in it, but that is like we're getting into metallurgy, I mean, there is iron in the body type of thing, but that's, so, okay, so these are the various basic, principles. And I think if I recall correctly, John had said he doesn't like physical chemistry, so, and I don't either, so we won't get too much into it. Okay, so we'll get back into something that I do know a little bit about is bioelectricity. So it has been around. It's not something that just came on with human being and Benjamin Franklin. Bacteria had discovered that. Okay, I think we got 5 more minutes. So I can go through a few more slides then. Okay, bacteria have discovered that long before when they were unicellular organisms as to how, and I just recently read into a book written by a scientist, come a philosopher of science, Australian. Okay, it's I'll show you the book when I stop the share at break time. Okay, and bacteria have the unicellular organisms which go under the deep ocean, have actually voltage, and they've shown this. So that is almost mind blowing when I saw about that. That they were able to show this. The organism which started out as single cell but joins, and, with other cells and has electricity at that time. And another classic example that is important for bacterial electricity is something called, bacterial cell membrane. That when bacteria, try to cooperate with each other and with electricity, and we join up and form what is known as a bacterial film. Okay, that is something called the biofilm, and that is a pain in the butt to treat. When biofilms form on something called, if you have artificial hip or artificial valve, if you're unlucky enough to catch infection, and if a biofilms forms, that is like the bacteria would usually, there can be single, but they collaborate with each other and form a nice film, and that is almost antibiotics cannot get in, and they can be very difficult to treat even with really latest greatest antibiotic. And the only recourse sometimes an orthopedic surgeon or a heart surgeon would be to take out the valve and replace it. And that can be a serious problem. So biofilms are a big challenge when it comes to, they use electricity in channels. Okay. And this was discovered in the early 50s, when people were doing research on electrical fields on lowly algae. And not only bacteria, but even fungi would use electricity using calcium to communicate at great distances underground. Okay, so electricity is everywhere. That is the point. And the classic example of that is electricity, how it generates electrical current. You're seeing with the protein in your eye. I'll have a slide for that when I talk about electricity and senses. The protein inside your eye, rhodopsin, that changes the shape and creates the current that eventually travels through your optic nerve. And that's how you let there be light. Okay, so these are the varieties of state that take place in the protein inside your retina. Okay, the ground state is present in the dark. Okay, so plants and fungi have electricity. And I think if you recall, I talked about the Indian scientist Jagdish Bose. He was recording electrical current back in the late 19th century and early 20th century. Okay, and just recently I had run into, there is something called flexoelectricity that was inside ice as well. Okay, and clouds have electricity, the thing. Okay, and so this is what I was talking about. This. Okay, I think we should stop here. We're getting to 2 o'clock your time and 11 o'clock my time, and I will stop my share right now. And okay, so hopefully you should be able to see the slide. Okay, and I think I have to go to my presenter view. No, wait a minute, I should have presenter view. Just stop share.
No, we've lost the slide.
Oh, no, I'm doing it again. So,
Okay.
okay, you should have it back again. Yeah.
Yep, good.
Nope. So, Okay, you should have a slide now.
Bioelectricity in animals.
Okay, yeah, you got it. So, okay, yeah, now it should be fine. Now you're good. Yeah. Okay, yeah, because I did not have my notes, that's why. Okay. Okay, so we were talking about bioelectricity in animals, okay? And this is what I alluded to earlier, glass sponges, So these are organisms that are, 500 million years old, and they are like a tiny thing occur at the bottom of the sea, and they have a skeleton made of silica, okay, as protection, acting. And inside their cell, they grow inside that, okay, and and they could actually get the water from the bottom and from the top and bottom, so to speak. So they're surviving on, bottom feeders basically. So they're benthic tiny animals, which are a few centimeters in length, and they're unicellular, but they join with other cells, so almost formed like a big, syncytium or continuation. And they've been known to have action potentials. So action potential has been around for since the beginning of life, okay? And these are, actually these are called porifera, and they can live, thousands of years basically. Okay, and so this is, and moving up to the evolutionary chain, octopus has neurons inside and, electrical potential. They're all individually operated, so it's almost like a discrete network. So they can, and this blew my mind when I saw this. We can move around biceps, flex and extend, or so we have, limited motions of our arm. The versatility of octopus arm is just phenomenal. You can just see how individually, how, they can surge, crawl, this thing, so forward, swimming, okay, walk, fetch. So I mean, so they are like a wizard of, and obviously, there have been so many popular books written about, my best friend octopus, and people have, done a lot of work. And a lot of these extreme mobility and versatility is done through something called voltage gated fast calcium channels. Okay, so again, the good old calcium comes into the way. And I don't know if people had time to see the slides, but I sent out a few slides from my class on senses, of the unusual senses, which is primarily magnetic and electrical, which shows the examples of shark and platypus. Okay, and they can use it for locating. So animal kingdom has used electricity for a long time for communication. Oh yeah, so okay, no, so these are just the old messages. Sorry, I was just checking on that. Okay, so this is, so electricity has, has had a long-standing history. Again, getting back to these cells, like, not to take away anything from genes, a centric view, but basic unit of life is still, as far from what I understand, is still the unit of life. Okay, and we talked about the holes in the wall, which is the ion channels. Okay, and this is, and this is all sloshing inside, the big so-called molecule of life that is water. Okay, that inside nicely laid out fiber optic cables. If you look at the inside of the cell, there's a huge chaos because all these molecules, okay, are joshing about in the medium of water, and there are like trillions of collisions taking place with each other of these various, molecules, and from that, life originates. Okay, all right, and and these are, various electrons and ions that take place. Okay, and normally, inside, any matter, any non-living matter, the charge, the two forces are balanced. The positive and negative. Okay, that's how matter can exist. My table exists because the balance, the elements are balanced with each other. And even if there is a slightest imbalance, okay, between two. Now, a lot of you may be familiar with Richard Feynman, the Nobel-winning physicist, very colorful personality to say the least. And he had done a series of lectures of, which the physics students, would swear by. It's called Feynman Lectures on Physics, which were available freely now, and there he teaches about even if there is 1% imbalance between the two positive and negative forces, okay, there will be enough force generated that you could lift the entire Earth, the voltage difference in the force and attraction, okay. And there are some writers of book, I showed about the book by Siddharth Mukherjee, about the Song of the Cell. There was another book which was called The Master Builder. It talks about the roles, the groundbreaking roles that the cells play. This is by a well-known scientist as well. Okay, I think, and the new science of cells is rewriting the story of life. So, and the interconnectedness that we are seeing. And I think I may have shown this earlier, but it's it's a lot more complex, when the cells collaborate with each other as a teamwork. Okay, and they are being recycled and cycled, because your red blood cells are replaced every few weeks, and so does your liver regenerate. Okay, and this is the famous quote from, if you're from the Midwest, you may remember a show on public television called Lake Wobegon. Okay, and Garrison Keillor, who was the host, used to start each show with every child is above average. Okay, all the women are strong and all the men are good looking. And this was, a cartoon that, which was during the heydays of stem cell. You can be anything that you want to be, and which is true. Okay, and that research was put on the back burner with the new restrictions that were placed on the cell lines. But now that problem has been averted by a research that was done by a Japanese scientist named Yamanaka. So any regular cells can be turned into something called a pluripotent cells, and so that is the objection that they had from the creationist and the religious lobby has been subverted. And this is an interesting thing about the potential of each and every cell, that the cell is happy when at rest, for somehow the other at minus 70 microvolts. Okay. Okay, so this is the quiescent state, and as the further it goes down, that thing, the bones have the much very negative, strong negative potential. Okay, and the cells in blue are excitable. Okay, the muscle cell, obviously, we already saw that neurons can be excitable. This is glial cells are inside your brain. That is like the glue of the brain. And the so-called big pyramidal cells get the big credits, but glial cells are the workhorse of the brain. Okay, they clean out all the garbage when you're sleeping. Okay, and these are the normal proliferating cells. When they have to grow, their potential is a little different of the resting cells. Okay, and the liver is somewhere in between. So that was a nice way of people have been able to, that all the cells are in your body, but they're all marched to a different music. It's like responding to which piece of orchestra you will concentrate on. Okay, now this is equally important, that this is now when they go around the cancer cells and proliferating cells, they hijack a lot of the machinery, and you can see how their potential changes, so they assume the characteristics of proliferating cells, so they are mimicking your normal liver cells goes haywire and decides it wants to steal all the energy, as I talked to you about, from the normal cells. And again, obviously, the underlying cause would be a mutation that may have taken place. But at the same time, the mutation alone is not going to be enough. It needs energy to be fruitful and multiply, so to, in a bad way. Okay, and so this is, this is how it changes the voltage and consumes more energy. Okay, And okay. Oh, yeah, I think this was, I'm sorry, I went past this, went too fast. Okay. And this is always amazing to me that this is what you studied in high school biology. You know, the cell is basically, this is the nucleus and something called the endoplasmic reticulum, and there are various granules inside the cell. Okay. And the varieties of what they call organelle, you know, and tiny little, you know, granules. And inside that, there are other granules which are called mitochondria, which are the energy cells. And people have, and a lot of this work was done by the Japanese scientists. They've actually measured the pH and voltage of each and every tiny little cell structure. So it just shows the advance of technology as to how different cells have different pH, the acid base, this thing, okay, and different voltage as well, okay. So it's an exquisite amount of how, even though these are all parts of an individual cells, their energy requirement, their chemistry is different, okay. And so this is, you know, it generates a form of energy and flow of particles, okay. And so this is, you know, how the whole orchestra is functioning inside each and every trillions of cells inside your body, okay. All right. And this was, I don't know where I came across this, you know, as 3 laws of biology. Okay. All the living systems obey natural laws. All the living system consists of membrane encased in cells. So this is one way to look at it, is it between the boundary between self and non-self. Okay. All right. Because obviously, you know, we are multicellular organisms. Okay. And basically, you know, all the organisms follow an evolutionary process. So these are, you know, like the obvious truths, okay. But all this, you know, we haven't covered the part is that this requires energy, okay, which we get from food. And at the same time, we create, you know, heat and water, okay. That's why, you know, when you're dead, your temperature drops basically. And that's used by, you know, coroners or pathologists to determine time of death, okay. And so this again, you know, and now this gets down to the concept. If you recall, we talked about Maxwell, and at the same time, that was the era of steam engine, and that proposed the whole science of thermodynamics came into effect, you know, which is how to create work, okay, with, you know, when you heat up water and it is dropped and turns the wheel and generates the steam, that means we're creating work. And the various French scientists in the early 19th century had created the whole science, and that is considered the cornerstone of physics, you know, the 3 laws of thermodynamics, okay. And but the living systems are a little different. They somehow they maintain their order in spite of the changing environments, you know. So that, you know, so they kind of violate or change you know, because in thermodynamics, if you recall to your high school physics, that is called the second law of thermodynamics, means the chaos or disorder always increases. Means if I drop a cup of a teacup, you know, it will shatter, but it will never get back together again, you know. So that is considered the unbreakable law of second law of thermodynamics. And just to segue sideways into it, back in 1950s, you know, a British physicist had written a nice article or segue between the 2 words. So if you're interested, you can look that up, the 2 words between arts and sciences, the 2 laws of, you know, how the twain shall never meet, so to speak. Okay, that mostly everybody who is educated at all, you know, would know who Shakespeare is. But if you ask the people from art about what is the second law of thermodynamics, they'll just shrug their shoulder. We don't. So he was outlining the separation of walls between arts and sciences. Okay, Okay, and there was a very interesting philosophical discussion on philosophy of science. Okay, and obviously a lot of that changed with the advent of Sputnik when we started emphasizing the STEM and put the arts on the other side. But again, I don't want to digress too much. Okay, so this was, basically, so that gets into the second law of thermodynamics. So the body system is spontaneously organized and, works against, because it's a so-called closed system. Okay, and it tries to maintain a word that was coined by a well-known French physiologist named Claude Bernard, called homeostasis. Means the body tries to maintain, the normal status. That is why it is difficult to lose weight after a certain weight, because initially you would lose weight, and when you finally the body says, no, this is the normal state I will revert back to. So it kind of flattens out, and that frustrates a lot of people, type of thing as to body. And that just would show you as to how, to like when I first moved from Tampa to Seattle, I was feeling cold at 72 degrees. Now I can run outdoors in 55. It's taken me 2 or 3 months to adjust, And similarly, somebody had told me about when we moved from Detroit, from Green Bay down to Florida. One guy had just told me, says, it'll take you 2 years before you start complaining about 60-degree weather. Okay, and he was right. That's that's the concept of homeostasis, in action as to how we subconsciously realize, that thing. So okay, and so this is the idea of how physics and biology are. Uh, did you have a question, David? Yeah, I don't know. Okay, I thought you were raising your hand. So okay, okay, and if anybody, people who are engineers and scientists, if you have more interesting or more knowledgeable things to say, please jump in. Okay, because I'm not a physicist by any means, and okay, how do we move energy? Okay, now electrons cannot move alone in the atom. So electrons can move as part of, now this was the thing, that is how biology is different than electricity that comes in your house. This works with electrons. Biology works with something called proton, which is primarily, charged hydrogen particles, as part of the, and move hydrogen, move electrons, okay, and oxidation and reduction, okay, because we talked about, the basic molecule of life is water, and that's how, you can just see this is recall the formula for glucose, okay, mixes with oxygen, oxidation, and carbon dioxide and water, and ATP, it's adenosine triphosphate, which is the currency of a body for energy. Okay, so this is the basic secret. Even if you don't remember anything from this class, if you remember this, you do well. That's how the energy is, so that is the whole secret of bioelectricity. And some of you may recognize Bob Newhart, okay, and after from his earliest 70s show, he had an appearance on the popular television series Big Bang Theory as Professor Proton, okay, and obviously that was a play on the charge fundamental unit placed in bioelectricity in ATP, okay, creation and utilization of electrochemical gradient across the membrane that takes place, okay, and so it can change with the spike of electrical potential. The membranes are very thin, okay, they're like 6 nanometers, means 10 to the power 9, okay, and the voltage is again in 150 millivolts, so it's a very tiny voltage difference. But when you look at the huge number of cells, you can see that the voltage inside and the number of mitochondria and particles that are there, the voltage can be, we're talking about several million volts per meter. Okay, obviously we don't have a meter length of cell surface, but it just goes that the energy is nothing to sneeze at. So this is the proton and electrons transport that takes place inside the body, provides the energy. And that is used as a part of cell signaling, okay? And so in Professor Proton, we trust, okay? And this is, basically the difference that I was able to form a slide. And we talked about the current war that Edison and Tesla went through, but this is a different type of current war. And this is an important point, so let us elaborate on it. This is the electron, okay? The charge carrier, that is electron, okay? Protons are positively charged. Environment, solid conduction in metal wires, okay? This occurs in electrolyte, battery acids, okay? Highly mobile, okay? The speed of light, basically, okay? And this is low mobility, this takes place, okay? And the size is different, okay? The mass is, obviously, this gets down to a real lot tinier, okay? And very light electrons. Well, protons are, substantially bigger and massive, okay? And this again gets down to the basic particle physics that we are talking about. And the speed is, this was a repeat, and the direction is negatively charged, from negative to positive. These are positively charged, so the direction is different, okay? And this is again a metal wire, versus it requires different condition, okay? And so this gets down into so this just outlines the difference between the two types of situation that takes place, okay? And so, and this is something called the reduction and oxidation, as I showed you earlier, type of thing. So, okay. And again, so the water is, the molecule that is, at the cornerstone or basic, it's involved. Okay, now all this bioelectricity is when we talked about Hodgkin and Huxley, that was, a groundbreaking discovery, obviously it would have revolutionized the field of research, okay? But that all changed in this year, okay? Because that all took a back seat because of this, okay? And the two young, rather, brash scientists, who just quietly came into a pub in Cambridge and just discovered in a very modest way, we have discovered the secret of life, okay? And these are, obviously the people would recognize, this is Watson and Crick, okay? Okay, they created the model and the rest is history, And so the era of the 20th century, we can rightly say that was heavily funded, and obviously they were standing on the shoulders of people who were toiling with documenting gene from the early 30s onward, a guy named Morgan at Columbia, okay? And but this was, that just opened up the floodgates of the era of genetics, which is again, wisely terminated with, CRISPR and modifying the gene-based therapy. And just, I don't know how many of you caught that, but just yesterday or day before, the people in Britain were able to modify Huntington's disease course based on genetics treatment. I mean, so that is groundbreaking, that thing. But again, we're dealing with single gene diseases. It is going to be a long time before anybody can handle chronic diseases such as heart disease or diabetes. And I'll have more to say about it as we go along. Okay. And this is, and just for non-genetic people to show that the so-called central dogma that Francis Crick said, this is, the basic rule of biology, that, okay. Now I think, okay, John, before we go around, I will stop the share. You want to show your copy of your book? Because I think our
No, I think I'm just listening here today, Bharat. Thank you, though.
okay, because I last time I my this thing that I had a picture of John's book, but I think somewhere along the line my slides were out of sync and I did not say. But John has written a nice cheap book, which is and published, which incorporates a lot of the stuff that I've talked about, from the energy from the sun and universe all the way, to life, so we can, I think it's a nice little book that, that you can get on Kindle, okay, and or on hardcover, that is available, and I think, it's a, it's his life work as to keep it for lay people. I think you may have to read it more than once, to understand, but it's, it's a nice way to summarize everything that, well, or at least some of it we have talked about. Okay, I think, okay, let's see, excuse me, I think, oh yeah, I had to go back into it. Okay, so now again, at the same time, we've talked about that the pendulum, at least in the popular science work, is getting to that, that we're forgetting the interplay of so-called web of life, okay, and the role of energy, because it's the biology is a lot more complicated and messy than just recognizing the code, because as we, when the Human Genome Project was around, we had high hopes that, Bill Clinton and Tony Blair said, well, we have discovered the mind of God, so to speak. That was his announcement, but we haven't, we have made some progress, but it has been very slow and frustrating for people that to cure chronic diseases has been very difficult. And this is one of the cynical ways that this is alive and not alive, so this is the DNA, and this is like complex stuff that occurs. So life happens here, and someday we'll figure it out, so it is it's a long journey. So it's like, we are fighting with, millions of years of evolution, so it's not going to be, and obviously the gene-centric view was heavily popularized in the late mind by Richard Dawkins, who wrote the rather very heavily sold popular book called The Selfish Gene. Okay, and again, when the computer guys, also followed in, they would think the life is basically bytes and bytes of digital information. And Larry Page, who was the founder of Google, okay, well, basically it's 600 megabytes, so that's, we should be able to figure that out, type of thing. So, okay, but again, so it's not, in biology, 1 + 1 does not always being a 2. Okay, so it's going to be more complicated than what we realize, So, and this is, and this was the Francis Crick, back in the 60s. He had said this is proposed that as a central dogma of biology, which is still, again, it's not 100% true, because viruses do it differently, type of thing. And so, and but this, majority of that is true, that the workhorse of biology are still proteins, which we have, one of our other friends did a class last summer on proteins, which was, but heavily science-based. So he talked about as a protein chemist, he did a class, and hopefully he'll repeat it someday. Okay, for those of you who have interest. Okay, so, but so there is a lot more thing in the background. Okay, and just to give you an example, a banana has 36,000 genes, and so do you and I have about 23,000 genes, and who's more complicated? Okay, you and I or a banana? So it's a lot more complicated. So having the number of genes alone is not going to be obviously sufficient. We have to learn about the interplay of all the molecules that are there. Okay, so, and this is, a book that there's a British science writer named Philip Ball, okay, who's just like we have in United States, and New York Times readers may recognize. We have Carl Zimmer, who writes very, very well about science. On the British side, there is a scientist named Philip Ball, who has written. So this is one of his books that I read recently about life. So he gets into the details of this. So this is his quote from his talk. Okay, and this is, so the complex stuff is all inside. So this is the true picture, color coded, based off inside of a cell. So this is Philip Ball, and this is his lecture, "What is Life and How Does It Work?" by Philip Ball. Okay, and this is not just like a sketch. This is the interplay of all the molecules that are jostling inside a small portion of a cell. Okay, so with various dyes, they can tag each and every all the organelles, which are the tiny little particles that are inside the cell. And so this is what it looks like. So trying to make sense out of it, it's going to take a few decades, to put it mildly, if then. Okay, and so there are varieties of patterns, and I think I may have mentioned that. If did, I apologize, that Alan Turing, the great computer scientist who cracked the Enigma code, had worked on something called patterns of morphogenesis, as to how the body forms similarity. And for those of you, I had sent you the slide on the very first slide from last week. You say about the handedness of molecules. Okay, see the mirror image of left and right hand. Okay, which is which was very important from the days of electricity, that the great Maxwell had made things about how the electric current in 3 dimension has a different formation. Okay, and that the right and left-handed side of body orientation, that the cells, have a way of migrate and figure out, and which is where the electrical current comes into the way, that inside the cell, there is no real code, because the cells have all same genes, but the right and left side parity, and that had a lot to do with in physics as well. Okay, and it was the so-called right and left side parity symmetry has a lot to do with it, and that was almost a groundbreaking research in physics, and that also translates some ways into biology as to how the cells have self-organizing behavior from a tadpole to a frog, and the right and left side of the orientation of the body. So it was a very interesting lecture from the place called Gresham College that, I just stumbled upon it, if you're interested, you can listen to it. There was a link in the one of the earlier slides from last step. Okay, so this is, so it's a lot more complicated. And again, a lot of the biology textbooks, just don't talk too much, may have a passing reference to energy. Okay, that thing. So this is where I'm trying to focus on this. And this is, now this is a slide from the good old reliable source called Wikipedia about electricity and electroporation in animals. And this is, the platypus has 40,000 receptors on the bill. Okay, and it turns, into best accuracies outwards and downwards, how it generates, the muscles of the prey create small electrical signals that bounce back, and that's how it's able to find its nutrition. And again, as we talked about, it says, and similarly, eels and varieties of types of organs. So electricity is widely used as a means of communication. And these are the so-called laws of thermodynamics that we talked about. Okay, conservation of energy, that was the first law. Okay, that's the second law. Entropy means disorder inside any system increases. Okay, and this is I already alluded to, and this is the concept of absolute zero that was very difficult to achieve, and people are almost getting to it. And this time, all the resistance disappears, and that leads into something called superconductivity. Conductivity. But again, this is not a physics class, so okay. Now, on a cynical view, you can look at life. The 3 laws of life. You can't win, you can't break even, okay, and you cannot get out of the game. So that's a cynical way of looking at a life by the physical view. So I just thought this. I had read that somewhere, and I thought it took me a while to find it again, but this was an interesting take on thermodynamics and life in general. Okay, so this is so when the biologists have given varieties of thoughts about this, and so it's a thermodynamic interpretation of life as to heat and energy. It's a set of processes that takes place in an open, non-equilibrium system. Okay, so this is like basically it maximizes the energy intake, and it minimizes energy surprise, information surprise. But that means it tries to maintain the homeostasis. That's another fancy way of putting that body tries to maintain, the status quo type of thing. And nature or evolution is fairly conservative. It doesn't like, so it uses, you may have the same mechanism for certain processes that is there in lowly fruit fly. And some of these channels are as old as the earliest organisms that was a single cell. So these things as nature can uses and reuses. And at the same time, it can change as the need arises. And the good example of that would be, ability to digest milk, okay, the lactose that has developed, in a few thousand years twice in different populations, It developed in the Maasai, and at the same time, it developed in the Northern European population as well. So, so just to not to rehash the point, it gets complicated. Okay. And again, this is another way of now looking at the electrical charge. Let's just show you how these are hyperpolarized. You can see the voltage is low. These are depolarized. Okay. And see the tumor cells, they do their own thing. They're similar to proliferating cells and assembling the early embryo and growing cell. When you're more mature, okay, you're just nicely, quietly sitting, minding your own business, non-proliferating cells. And at the same time, so this is, how it goes about, polarized versus depolarized. So the electrical charge varies quite a bit depending upon which cell population you're dealing with. Okay. Again, these are important points, so that's why I'm repeating them. Okay. So these are the varieties of ways of molecular motors take place, and I'll have a nice slide for this so-called ciliary motor inside an amoeba or E. coli that has various cilia with which it can get feedback. So it senses the system. While the same way you and I have ion channels where we exchange charged particles or charged ions, we generate. Okay. And so molecular, sorry, went back. ATP ion gradients, and it is used for varieties of purposes. Motors, molecular motors, which are actually rotating of a circular motion, transport and for moving around. That's how the E. coli gets around, by moving the cilia. Okay. Well, bioelectricity, we already talked about the action potential at length. Okay. All right. So there are two different ways, in which electricity can be used. Okay. And there are, there are some interesting videos that I think, for the sake of time, I'm not going to show about how the actin and myosin, which are the basic proteins inside your individual muscles, as to how it marches along the, microtubules. Okay. Okay. So. Okay, I'm sorry. Let's just go remove my toolbar so it doesn't block my cheat sheet. Okay, and as we talked about, ATP is the working molecules, okay, and which is generated from food, and the molecular motors are located inside the membranes, okay, and these are all powered by, the workhorse, a proton, or the hydrogen gradient across this thing. So that is develops the voltage across the membrane, okay, and so this is one of the basic mechanism of cell signaling that takes place, okay, and these are all we already mentioned about the calcium ions, which are, that's why whenever the cardiac arrest, if you're trying, before you get your pedals ready, you give a calcium injection, that improves your chance of restoring normal rhythm. So it's, if you've ever taken the cardiac life support, you'll see that calcium gluconate injection is part of the protocol. Okay, so this has a practical significance, this basic science, as to how it translates into saving lives. Okay, now this is an interesting lecture by a physicist, named Dr. Wallace, who has been working, incorporating physics and biology, that is biophysics together. And this is his very erudite lecture about the role of mitochondria. Okay, and this is, let's speed. We can time for it. Okay, let me go forward. Okay, yeah. The interest is that that we have worked on genetics, and basically the medical science has always concentrated on organ systems, because if you have a headache, you go to a not just nowadays, not just to a primary doctor, you rush to a neurologist, thinking that okay, that may be related to my brain or head. Okay, the same way, if you have indigestion, you rush to. So we have been compartmentalized based on gross anatomy, to think about, and that's the medical profession has, encouraged that with subspecialization, so to speak. While we have forgotten to look at the entire bodies, these things, or the so-called holistic approach as to how things can be interconnected. Now the thinking on that is changing, that people are looking at the role of immunity and inflammation. Okay, even in cardiology, in my own fields, things have changed dramatically. We used to stick emphasize on cholesterol, and everything was based on the so-called cholesterol hypothesis. But now we are learning that the role of inflammation is a lot more important in terms of causing diseases, of heart disease type of thing. And again, living in bad environment, having stress has a lot to do with it. So there are varieties of environmental factors maybe playing a role, and metabolic diseases, again, your microbial these things, okay. And so all of these are related. So this is where the Dr. Professor Wallace's talk are important as to how mitochondria. Now let's see if we can make sense out of this. Mitochondria is now, let me jump one forward. I think I want to go back. Okay, I'm going to say that, first of all, let's go ahead with what is mitochondria. This was, always originally there was a cell, and now this is most people with any, basic, not even necessarily science education would know Watson and Crick. Some people may now. John's book talks about Carl Woos, who had proposed the third branch of evolution called archaea. These are the primitive organisms that he had isolated based on, something called ribosome analysis. But he never got too much credit for it. But that is the third, branch of evolution. Okay. And now around the same time in the 70s, this is a woman that some of you, only the biologists may recognize. Her name was Lynn Margulis. I'm sure most of you have not heard her name, but you may recognize her husband, okay, Carl Sagan, okay, and they got divorced. That's why there was her name. Her professional name was, but she was a biologist, and she had proposed the concept of symbiosis. Means the original primitive cell had swallowed another bacteria, and that went on to become, in animal kingdom, went on to become mitochondria, and in plants became chloroplast. And again, I think so this was, her unifying her. That was the original of mitochondria. Now let's go back to the, okay. And so this is the, we're looking for, or trying to understand the origin of complex diseases and the role of energy. So this is what a mitochondria is. That so when it went inside, now when you have your DNA analysis, you're looking at your nuclear DNA, but what you inherit from your mother is called mitochondrial DNA. Okay, and back in the 90s was popular about the origin of mitochondrial DNA. The 7 Daughters of Eve. There was a popular book written by a British geneticist, as to how you inherit your mitochondrial DNA from your. And now originally it was, people only talked about the so-called nuclear DNA, but now even the crime shows are getting into the idea of mitochondrial DNA as to how that can help. And that can be it's a relatively small number of genes, but they can be extremely important. And if you have abnormalities of that, you can get in some serious trouble. Okay. So that is nothing to sneeze at. And okay, so talking back into the basic biology or physiology of mitochondria, it has two layers, the outer layer and the inner layer. The outer layer is nice, smooth, round, or the inner layer, and inside that is the so-called cytoplasm or protoplasm, whatever you want to call it. And the mitochondria gets energy from glucose, and then varieties of complex biological steps that you can just ignore basically, and it turns into lactate that you recognize that if you're over exercising and we are running out of energy, you build up your lactate. And alanine is one of the amino acids, by the way, essential. So this is how it gets into it, inside, and it gets through various complex system with something that called, and it gets into the cell membrane called respiratory chain, where it generates hydrogen molecule. And in the end, just to summarize, the important part is would concentrate on this something. It generates ATP, which is the work. The other steps you can just safely ignore. There are varieties of complexes in the respiratory chain where it interacts with oxygen. Okay, that's why you breathe. When you don't get enough oxygen, you're going to get into trouble. So that's how the energy is metabolized, and turns into and so this is, and when it goes awry, it forms called reactive oxygen radicals and can cause toxins of mitochondria. Okay, so this is, a very finely tuned mechanism. And and obviously when the mitochondria become toxic, they're smart enough, they commit, apoptosis, mean they decide to die themselves and are taken out of, become garbage and recycled. Okay, so but the formation is this, all this complex chemical dance it generates energy. That's the long and short of it. And if there are issues with that, you form reactive or free radicals that can again damage your cells. So the energy becomes extremely important, and that is where all of these factors, so the highest forming, the highest consuming organs in your body are the ones which form the most diseases: brain, heart, liver. Okay, these are the biggest consumption of energy. Okay, so that's why you get most of and obviously, and to some extent, kidney. Okay, so that is where we run into issues, when we get toxins or stress or this thing. And you may be surprised, there is even a branch of something called psychobiology, where they have shown the changes inside the mitochondria or the energy mechanism when you're under your cell. And how did they show this? Your hair turns gray. Okay, when you're under stress. So they were able to do the mechanism of a 40-year-old. Okay, they went back and looked at the changes in that something called mitosome. Okay, you recognize your genome, so they recognize the the changes in the mitochondria. Okay, and so yeah, did you have a stressful event in your life? Sure, you did. It was just mind-blowing when I listened to that. I said, well, this is just far out or amazing piece of detective work. Okay, so this is one of the things about the role of energy that is extremely important and plays a big role. So we may be underestimating it when we just say that, okay, well, we'll do the CRISPR genes and we'll fix our chronic diseases. And again, that has been a lot more complicated to find. So the role of energy has, that's one of the reasons why I'm talking about it here. Okay. Okay, instead of just pure anatomy or totally gene-based from. Okay. Okay, so it's basically, so all the things play a role: energy, information, and so there are, each cell has hundreds of. So this is the so-called unifying hypothesis. We already talked about. I showed you this side. Okay, and basically, I'm sorry, the last one was this important, that you are, composed of. Okay, yeah, so this is, basically what, so instead of, this is a cynical observation. Instead of I think therefore I am, which is the famous Descartes statement, I react, therefore I am. So so interplay of the big elements in which compose your body: carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur type thing. So okay, and so when your body stops forming energy, that's when you die. So the difference between the working body versus cold body. So okay, so this is a way of looking at it. Okay, and again, just to emphasize, you're basically you're children of your sun, of the sun, which gives you energy, creates plants and animals. Okay, and you're part of the great chain of life. Okay, like the original statement was the great chain of being. That was proposed in the 19th century. Okay, but the same way you are part of the great chain of energy that starts from the sun. And one of the physicists had written a book called The Ultimate Free Lunch, that we are getting the energy. Okay. And again, as we talked about in the laws of thermodynamics, the energy is, the total energy is either converted to another form, either heat or cannot be created nor destroyed, so to speak. So, okay. Okay, so I think we're coming up to 12 o'clock, and I don't know if we should continue or just stop. I think probably we should take. I mean, I've caught up with I've gone from like 30 to about 45 slides. So I think we should be good for the next couple of weeks. Type thing. So, and I will try to. So okay, so this is basically just another way of looking at it. So nice way of looking at energy and the various activities. I just added it this morning that basically the energy and heat are important. The chemical energy is transferred into electrochemical force. Okay, let's see what else I have. And yeah, this maybe I think you'll get a kick out of it. This was the picture of the individual mitochondria. Okay, all right. This is they're all tiny little things inside organelle inside your cell, but they're all different. Okay, this is a picture of the mitochondria inside the nerve axon. You can see what that looks like. Okay, the top left is axon. Okay, and bottom left. Okay, I'm sorry, I'm getting. Okay, this one is inside your adrenal gland. Okay, which secretes your adrenaline type of thing. Okay, and let's see. Nope, I think I'm going fast. Okay, this is inside a muscle. Okay, and then one is inside the heart, which is continuation. Okay, so the mitochondria, depending upon the energy requirement of organ, because heart and brain are a big energy hog, so they're densely packed with mitochondria. Okay, that's the point that we wanted to make, basically. Okay, all right. So I think we should probably stop here instead of overrunning type of thing, and I think we are done with mostly with the energy thing, this thing. And let me just stop the share and see what I have coming up. Okay, and I will send out the slides as usual along with the recording. And next time we'll talk about the heart and how electricity is involved inside heart. And then during the last session, we'll talk about some of the technology, including the brain stimulation with electricity and some of the devices that can be used, and also talk about the regenerative medicine, the research that is being done. Okay, so let's stop here and I'll stick around for a while. And thank you folks for joining.
Thank you.
It was fun.
Thank you. Look like